Welcome to my tube rolling video for the Sparco's Gemini tube amp. If you haven't seen the review of this one and you're not familiar with the Gemini, you may want to check out the link down below through to the full review to understand what this does, what the tweaks are all about. I'll be talking about the bias settings and the gain settings in this video, so it's going to be worth knowing what those mean, how that all works, so check out the link to the review if you don't know about it. But if you do know all about it already, let's just jump straight in to talking about some of the tubes I've tried in the Gemini and how they sounded. How I'm going to approach this is that I started off all my tube rolling with the stock 6922 tube from Electro Harmonix, and then from there I've rolled through one tube to the next, and so I'm going to talk about what the difference is each time. So rather than always coming back to the 6922 as a starting point, I'll just describe the changes and hopefully it'll give you a good sense of what each different tube does and the kind of journey that you can go on with tubes and the Gemini headphone amp. So starting off with the Electro Harmonix 6922 tube that comes in the Gemini, the first step I took was to another equivalent tube in a 6DJ8. This one was one of the Bugle Boy tubes. I can't remember the brand of these, but if you Google or do an eBay search for 6DJ8 Bugle Boy, these will no doubt come up if there's any still floating around. And essentially they're a premium NOS 6DJ8/6922 tube. What I heard as I went across to the Bugle Boy was that it was essentially the same type of tube sound, but just more refined and more detailed. So I got a sense of cleanliness and clarity and refinement from the Bugle Boy that was just a step above the 6922 that comes stock. Beyond that, everything else was about the same, so I'm going to move straight on to the next tube that I tried, and that was to move over to the recently reviewed Apos Ray tubes. These are a 12AU7, they're a brand new production tube that are being retailed by Apos Audio, and when I reviewed them, they really impressed me with their sound. Now, as far as I know, they only come in pairs, which is more than what you need for the Gemini, but if you know somebody else with a Gemini, you could buy a box and split them between you. I'll leave that up to you. But moving across to the 12AU7 Apos Ray, the first thing I had to do was change the jumper for the heater setting. So remember, some tubes need a different voltage for the heaters to work effectively or to work at all in some cases. And so I changed that, plugged in the 12AU7 and started listening. The first thing I noticed was that the sound with the 12AU7 in there was a bit crisper. The top end got a little bit too lean, almost a bit metallic in some ways, and it was clearly a less natural sound to me. It actually had me starting to wonder if the Gemini was tuned specifically with the 6922 in mind. But then this is where the tweakability of the Gemini comes in, going from low gain to high gain, and suddenly it started to sound better. By taking a bit of the tube influence out, in the case of the 12AU7 at least, by taking that tube influence out and putting a bit more emphasis into the solid state stage, things started to balance out and sound more natural. I then tried playing around with the bias settings, and I found that actually putting the bias setting to have more tube influence, that was a bit different again. So I don't know if the bias setting behaves a bit different to the gain setting in terms of the behavior of the tube. That's something I'll be asking Andrew when I do an interview with him. That's Andrew Sparkos from Sparkos Labs. I'll ask him about the difference between the bias and the gain influence because it seemed to change the performance and the sound of the tube, not just the amount of the tube that I was hearing. And by the way, on that note, if you've got questions that you want me to ask Andrew about different tubes and rolling them through the Gemini, or any other questions about the Gemini, Sparkos Labs products in general, then leave your questions in the comments down below. I'll be sure to check them all out before I interview Andrew. Now, if the interview's already come out, I'll also put a link to the interview in the description box of this video. So check that first, because if the interview is done, leaving your questions down below, I'm not going to be able to ask Andrew. But if you're watching this video and it's fresh, let me know your questions. I look forward to asking Andrew soon. And so now let's move on, going from the 12AU7 Apos Ray tube and moving over to an Electro Harmonix Goldpin 12AU7. And this was quite interesting. I was curious to see if the Electro Harmonix Goldpin 12AU7 had similar tuning and character to the Electro Harmonix 6922 that's stock in the Gemini. I'm very familiar with this Goldpin Electro Harmonix from use in other tube amps, and it's quite a rich, thick, warm sounding tube. It's not warm and rich to the point that it loses detail, but it's a closer in sound, it's got more meat to the bones you could say, and it's a tube that I really enjoy, but one that I recognise as being more clearly coloured. What I found with the Electro Harmonix Goldpin 12AU7 was that now I preferred the Gemini with the gain setting to low gain, so getting more tube sound from the gain, but changing the bias to get less tube sound from the bias. And so this is where it starts to get really interesting with the Gemini. For each tube that you put into this amplifier, you're going to have a different set of settings that get you the best possible sound based on your preferences. And that's really fun. There might be those of you out there that are going, that's too hard, I don't want to fiddle with that, that's totally fine. But for me, I love the fact that if I've gone out and spent money on a tube, I can then adjust the amplifier to really suit the tube to get the very, very best out of the money that I've spent on that piece of glass. What I started to learn by this point was that I think the solid state stage from the Gemini, that being what goes through the Pro op amps from Sparco's labs in the output stage, they're quite smooth sounding output. And so what I started to find was that the tube that you put in there, if it's a particularly smooth, rich, warm tube, you're generally going to want to have less of its influence going in. But if you get a tube that's got a bit of a brighter, cleaner and more detailed sound, like say the Apos Ray 12AU7, that's where you might actually want a little bit more of that tube to offset the smoothness, and not smooth in a bad way, but the smoothness and the refinement of what you're getting from the Sparco Labs op amps. And again, all it comes down to is have a quick play. You can go through all these settings that I'm talking about within a matter of moments, because all you need to do is start off with the bias setting in one position and try the high gain and the low gain, switch off the amp, switch over the jumper for the bias setting, and then play it again, high gain, low gain, and work out which one you like the most. I think it's a really fun way to get to know the tubes and get to know the amp, and I love the fact that this has been designed to do it. Moving on then to one more tube type, and so I was leaving the Electro Harmonix 12AU7 gold pin and putting in a new old stock 6N1P tube. These are a Russian tube. I've got a whole bunch of them here because they're also what's used in the shit Folkvanger. And so putting in the 6N1P or the 6N1 variety as it's listed in the Sparco Labs manual, that requires a change of the heater setting back to the same setting as it comes in stock. That's how it's used with the 6922 tube that it comes with. And so making that change, what I found now was that the 6N1P brings the mid-range a bit forward, but it's also less meaty than something like the 12AU7 from Electro Harmonix, the gold pin one. I found with the 6N1P that it was kind of a tough call which setting I like the most. It's a really nice tube. I enjoy the 6N1s. I've got a few different versions here. I've tried all of them in the Gemini, and in all cases, it tends to sound good with any setting, and it tends to come down to a personal preference or the synergy with the particular headphones you're using as to which settings are best. But I tended to find that I like the 6N1Ps with the low bias setting, which is kind of your maximum tube influence from the bias, and then generally low gain. The reason I like that is that the 6N1s have a wonderful kind of liquid and organic sounding mid-range. And then the fact that you can quickly switch between the low gain and the high gain to get a bit more or a bit less of that, that's where I really love the Gemini. And so after rolling through these various tube options and setting options, I started trying to put together a list of my preferred setups for the Gemini. And I think I kind of agree with Andrew in the sense that I do tend to prefer it with the 6DJ8/6922 tubes. That's what comes in at stock is a 6922. But for me, it's definitely with the upgraded Bugle Boy NOS tube. That results in a sound that's very articulate, very kind of neutral and natural and detailed, but it's still also very smooth, and you can adjust the level of smoothness with the bias jumper and or the gain switch. So that just wins into my first position, I think. I also, though, thoroughly enjoyed it with the Electro Harmonix Gold Pin 12AU7 because of that beautiful, thick, meaty sound that tube brings. Again, you can have more or less of that with the various settings. And for me, I really liked the Gold Pin 12AU7 in the high bias setting, so you've got minimum tube influence from the bias, but low gain, so you were still getting plenty of tube influence. And then from there, I also thought the 6N1P was wonderful. And so for me, the only tube that I wasn't a particular fan of in the Gemini was the 12AU7 from Apos Audio. That's not to say it's a bad tube, it's a wonderful tube. I just don't know that a really clean and detail-focused tube is necessarily the best fit for this amplifier for my tastes. Now keep in mind, I was able to get it sounding wonderful because of that adjustability, being able to funnel more of the sound through the output stage and less of it through the tube. I was able to get it sounding fantastic. I guess for me the problem was I really wasn't getting the most out of such a wonderful tube. I'd rather use a tube with a slightly different character and then get the most out of it. To really make the use of both the solid state and the tube stages within the Gemini, that's where I see value here. And so as I said at the end of my review of the Gemini, I think this is just brilliant for those that want to tube roll, tweak, play around and adjust the sound exactly to your tastes. That's where the value lies here. As I also said in the Gemini review, I love the fact that you can do it with a single tube. That makes it really easy to buy tubes, you're not worrying about getting matched pairs or anything like that. And then on top of that, you can also often pick them up cheaper because you're not having to hunt for matched pairs. So you can buy the stragglers that someone's got left over, and they're often going to be much cheaper. And so once again, as I said in the review, I think the Gemini is an absolute winner of an amplifier. I think it's brilliant for those that want to tweak and play and tube roll. I'm guessing if you're watching this video, that's you. And on that note, if you've got a Gemini and you've tried some tubes of your own, let us know in the comments down below which tubes have you enjoyed and what have been the settings that you've liked most. Do you like it with more of the tube added in through the bias or through the gain or a bit of both? What's your favourite setups? So let us all know in the comments down below. But for now, I hope you found this video useful and helpful. As always, if you have, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.